I didn't burn Halcyon Pay to the ground. I want that on the record before you get comfortable. I didn't leak a password, I didn't tip off a regulator, and I certainly didn't short the stock. Mostly because you can't short a private company, but also because I don't need to gamble when I can just be patient. I built a house. Somebody else decided to take a sledgehammer to a load-bearing wall while I was standing in the kitchen. I simply stepped outside before the roof came down. If you want to know exactly how a 2-inch strip of brushed steel and one paragraph of legal boilerplate turned a $250 million funding round into a smoking crater and turned a man who owns 4 Patek Philippe's into a person who cried in front of his own general counsel, get comfortable. This one takes a while to build, but I promise you the collapse at the end is worth every minute. Pour something. I mean it. What you're about to hear involves a level of executive incompetence so pure, so unfiltered, that I genuinely think it should be bottled and sold as a cautionary tincture to business schools. I've told this story twice at dinner parties, and both times somebody had to leave the table to go throw up a little in their mouth, out of secondhand embarrassment, not literal illness. So yes, drink. You'll need it. And hey, if you're the kind of person who enjoys watching a woman with a spreadsheet and a lot of patience quietly dismantle a man who inherited his job, go ahead and hit subscribe, drop a like, whatever the algorithm wants from you today. I write these stories because apparently I have never once in my life let go of a grudge cleanly. I have to launder it into content first. Fine by me. Let's get into it. My name is Dana Reyes. For 6 years, I was the chief architect of fraud systems at Halcyon Pay, a payment processing company you have definitely used without knowing it, because we sat quietly behind the checkout button of about 400 mid-size retailers, humming along in the background like a bouncer nobody notices, until the night someone tries to walk in with a fake ID and a stolen credit card number. People think fraud detection is some junior analyst squinting at a spreadsheet of suspicious transactions. It is not. Not at our scale. At our scale, it's a living, breathing decision engine, making tens of thousands of risk calls a second, in the time it takes you to blink, deciding whether the card swiping through a gas station in Tulsa actually belongs to the person swiping it, or whether it was stolen 4 hours ago in a data breach nobody's announced yet. I built that engine, not with a team handing me a spec sheet. I built it from a legal pad and a caffeine addiction, back when Halcyon was 19 people crammed into a converted print shop in Denver, and our biggest client was a regional mattress chain. I called it the Sentinel Core. Cute name, I know, but the thing earned it. Sentinel didn't just flag fraud after the fact, like every legacy system on the market at the time. It predicted it before the authorization even finished routing, using a layered fingerprinting model that watched device behavior, geolocation drift, keystroke cadence, 100 quiet signals no human being could track in real time. In my first 18 months, Sentinel cut Halcyon's fraud losses by 81%, while our authorization approval rate for legitimate customers went up. That combination, fewer false declines and fewer actual frauds, is the holy grail in this industry, and everyone said it couldn't be done simultaneously. I did it in a converted print shop with a space heater under my desk because the landlord wouldn't fix the furnace. I want you to understand something about people like me before this story gets ugly, because it's going to get very ugly. I don't build things to get credit. I build things because an unsolved, elegant problem sitting in front of me feels like an itch I cannot ignore. I lived inside that code base. I dreamed in Python and woke up debugging in my head before my alarm went off. Sentinel wasn't a line item on a resume to me. It was closer to a second nervous system. One I'd spend 6 years teaching to recognize danger a half second before anyone else could see it coming. But here's the thing nobody tells you about building something that valuable inside somebody else's company. The code is never really safe just because it's good. It's not safe from hackers. I had that covered 6 ways from Sunday. Redundant intrusion detection, isolated environments, the whole fortress. What it's never safe from is the people who technically own the building the fortress sits in, the suits, the ones who didn't build it, don't understand it, and will absolutely walk in one day and decide the moat is friction that needs to be removed for a smoother user experience. So 5.5 years ago, back when Halcyon was still small enough that I could walk into the founder's office without an appointment, I sat down with our outside counsel at the time, a courtly, permanently sunburned man named Elliot Whitfield, who spent about 40% of every meeting talking about his upcoming golf trips, and I redlined my employment agreement myself. I didn't ask for more salary. I didn't ask for a bigger title. I asked for one paragraph buried on page 31 of an appendix nobody but a masochist reads in full, Appendix E, Section 7.3, wedged between two much duller clauses about relocation reimbursement and non-compete geography. It said, in language so dry it could double as kindling, that while Halcyon Pay retained ownership of code developed in the normal course of business, the core fraud detection architecture, defined explicitly by name as the Sentinel core and its underlying source logic, would revert in full to my personal ownership in the event the company materially altered the fundamental security protocols governing that architecture without my express written consent. Whitfield read maybe the first sentence of that paragraph out loud, saw I wasn't asking for equity or a raise, and stamped it without another word, because he had a tea time in 40 minutes. That signature was, as I would later describe it to my own lawyer with far more relish than any professional should admit to, the pin I carried in my pocket for 5.5 years, waiting for someone reckless enough to pull it. I want to be clear that I never once planned to use it against the man who built the company. Walter Ashford was, whatever his other flaws, someone who actually understood what he didn't understand. He trusted me because I'd earned it. He let engineers run engineering, and under his watch, Halcyon grew from 19 people in a print shop to 400 and change, processing $11 billion a year across our client network. I liked Walter. I would have happily built alongside him until one of us retired. Then, 2 years ago, Walter's cardiologist gave him a very stern lecture about cholesterol and stress, and Walter decided, with the kind of clarity that only comes from a man staring down his own mortality, that it was time to hand the reins to his son and go buy a vineyard in the Douro Valley. That is how Colton Ashford walked into my life, and I promise you, everything that happens for the rest of this story is entirely, 100% his fault. Colton Ashford was 31 years old and had never, as far as I could determine in 6 years of working 2 floors below him, held a job that wasn't handed to him by someone who shared his last name. He'd done a stint at his father's old private equity firm, doing something vague with strategic partnerships, which, as far as I could tell, meant attending steakhouse dinners on the company card. He wore a rotation of 5 suits that each individually cost more than my first car, and he had the specific glassy-eyed enthusiasm of a man who had read exactly one book about disruption and treated it like scripture. He walked onto the trading floor. Sorry, old habit. There was no trading floor. This was payments. But he insisted on calling the open office the floor because he thought it sounded more Wall Street. On his first day with the energy of a golden retriever who had just discovered an entire unattended charcuterie board. He shook every hand he passed, memorized nobody's name, and by lunch had already rebranded the company Slack channel from General to Halcyon Fam, which 400 employees collectively pretended not to notice. He found his way to my office by day 3. I remember because he didn't knock. He never knocked, not once in the entire miserable arc of our professional relationship, which I've come to understand is a specific breed of confidence you can only develop by never once in your life being told no by someone whose opinion you respected. Dana! He said my name like we were old fraternity brothers reuniting at a tailgate. He sat, uninvited, on the edge of my desk, which put his very expensive Italian loafer approximately 4 inches from my keyboard. I've been looking at the Sentinel deck. Impressive stuff, truly. But I gotta be honest with you, it's giving me legacy energy. It's giving you an 81% reduction in fraud losses, I said, not looking up from my monitor. I take that kind of legacy. He laughed, a short, barking sound that I would come to recognize over the following months as his signature response to anything he didn't understand well enough to argue with. No, I mean the architecture. It's a black box. Nobody can see inside it. Nobody can explain it to our partners in plain English. And honestly, in this market, that's a liability. We need to open it up, modernize the stack. I'm thinking generative AI risk scoring, maybe some blockchain settlement rails for the enterprise tier. Get some real buzz going before the next raise. I want you to understand that I sat there and let a 31-year-old man who did not know the difference between latency and bandwidth explain to me, the person who had built the system he was describing, that my life's work needed buzz. I have a very high tolerance for corporate nonsense. You develop one in this industry. But something in my chest went very quiet and very cold in that moment. The specific stillness you feel right before you decide someone is no longer worth arguing with, only worth documenting. Colton, I said, choosing my words the way you'd choose footing on ice, the security layer isn't decorative. It's not a design choice we can swap out for something shinier. It's load-bearing. If you touch the authentication handshake without understanding what it's load-bearing for, you don't modernize the system, you blind it. That's exactly the kind of thinking I'm trying to get past, he said, hopping off my desk, straightening his cuffs like he'd just closed a very important deal. I've got a guy starting Monday, Zane Kowalski. Absolute wizard, ran risk product at a crypto exchange before some stuff happened that wasn't his fault. He's going to run point on modernization. You'll report into him for the technical side. I did not, for the record, react. I have spent 6 years building a machine that reacts to danger in microseconds while showing absolutely nothing on the surface. And I like to think some of that discipline rubbed off on me personally. I smile the smile I reserve for men who have just said something they will regret, and I said, "Sounds efficient." "That's the spirit," he said, and winked, actually winked, and walked off to go high-five a junior account manager in the hallway. The way you'd celebrate a touchdown you hadn't personally scored. I watched him go, and I felt something settle over me that I can only describe as the calm of a woman who has just found out with total certainty exactly how this is going to end. I want to be honest with you. I wasn't afraid. I could have walked out that afternoon and had 3 competing offers by Friday. Fraud architects with real production experience are not exactly sitting on every street corner. What I felt instead was something closer to grief. Watching a man who had never built anything prepared to take a scalpel to something he couldn't even name the parts of. He didn't ask what powered the false positive suppression layer. He didn't ask why the authentication handshake ran on every single transaction instead of once per session. He saw a black box, and black boxes to men like Colton Ashford exist purely to be opened, gutted, and rebuilt with his name stamped on the outside. I turned back to my monitor. I opened a folder on my personal air-gapped laptop, encrypted with a key that existed nowhere on any Halcyon server, and I pulled up a scanned copy of my employment contract. I scrolled to Appendix E, Section 7.3, and I read it again, slowly, the way you'd reread the terms of a life insurance policy right before doing something reckless. Fundamental security protocols. Express written consent. Reversion of ownership. Okay, Colton, I said quietly, to nobody, to the humming servers 2 floors below. You want to drive? Go ahead. But you'd better hope you don't crash because I own the road, the car, and every single one of the guardrails. I spent that evening backing up my own history. Every commit, every code review, every internal ticket, every email in which I had, on the record, warned somebody in writing that a specific change would compromise the security architecture. I wasn't being paranoid. Paranoid is worrying about something that probably won't happen. I was simply preparing an autopsy for a patient who hadn't died yet, because I already knew, with the certainty of someone who has watched this exact movie before, that he was going to. The office smelled different after that, less like the burnt coffee and quiet hum of people solving hard problems, and more like cologne, ego, and the specific desperation of men trying to prove something to a father who'd left the country. The storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived, and it was wearing a $5,000 suit and asking, very politely, for the master key. Zane Kowalski arrived the following Monday, and I want to describe him to you with the reverence he deserves, because he really was a specific and rare specimen. He wore a quarter-zip vest over a graphic t-shirt that said something about disrupting disruption in a font clearly chosen to look hand-drawn. His hair had the architecturally improbable quality of having been producted into a shape that defied basic physics. Gravity, apparently, just another legacy system he'd decided not to respect. He used the word synergy 4 times in the first 90 seconds of his introduction at the all-hands meeting, which I counted because I was already building a file. We're going to de-silo the risk data, Zane announced, pacing the small stage in our main conference room like a man auditioning for a TED Talk nobody had invited him to give. Halcyon's been operating on a legacy risk mindset for way too long. We're migrating the entire fraud stack to a cloud-native, fully open architecture. Move fast, iterate in production, get comfortable breaking things. I sat in the back row with a coffee that had gone cold approximately 40 minutes earlier and thought, with the specific serenity of a woman who has already accepted her fate, you break things in a payment processing company, Zane, and the Federal Reserve breaks your knees. But I stayed quiet. I had, by that point, been quietly reclassified. My new title, delivered via a one-line email from HR with the subject line Org Update, was Senior Legacy Systems Consultant. Same salary, 0 authority. A demotion dressed up in a title long enough to sound like a promotion if you didn't read it too closely, which, I noted, was exactly how Whitfield had gotten my original clause past him in the first place. Poetic in a bleak way. They also moved my office. I'd had a corner space with actual windows for 4 years. By the following Wednesday, I was relocated to what had previously been a supply closet near the restrooms on the 2nd floor, generously repurposed with a desk and a chair that squeaked in a register I could feel in my molars. It was, I understood immediately, a humiliation campaign, engineered to make me quit loudly enough that they wouldn't owe me severance. Colton wanted me gone. He was too much of a coward to fire the woman who built the machine that made his company function. So instead, he wanted me to rage quit into the sunset so he could tell the board it was my choice. He badly underestimated my capacity for spite. I have, historically, an almost professional-grade tolerance for indignity when I know exactly what's coming for the person dishing it out. The first real clash happened 2 days later. Zane marched into my supply closet without knocking, a house style at Halcyon by then, apparently, clapping his hands together like he was starting a huddle. Dana, I need the root credentials to the fraud detection dev environment. Me and the team are spinning up the new repo and we keep hitting a permission wall. That's because it's an air-gapped environment, Zane, I said, not turning from my screen. On purpose. That's where the live fraud model runs. If somebody introduces a bug there, we're not talking about a bad user experience. We're talking about approving stolen cards in real time, at scale, across 400 retail partners. Right, guardrails, I get it. He waved a hand like he was swatting away a gnat. But Colton wants single sign-on across the whole stack. Way too much friction right now. Everybody's got 9 different logins. I actually turned around for that one. You want single sign-on on the fraud engine? You want an intern logging into the system that decides whether a $4,000 laptop purchase is legitimate, using the same password he uses for his fantasy football league? It's about velocity, Dana. Friction kills innovation. Incompetence kills solvency, I said. I can't authorize that change. Compliance Policy 14, Section 3. Only the chief architect of fraud systems can approve modifications to the core security architecture. And since your title, last I checked, is head of modernization strategy and not chief architect of anything, you don't get the keys. His face went a specific blotchy pink that I would come to recognize as his tell. I don't think you understand how this works now. Colton put me in charge of the whole stack. Then have Colton send me a signed, written directive overriding Compliance Policy 14, I said, turning fully to face him for the first time. In writing, explicit language stating that he's authorizing a bypass of the established security architecture against the documented advice of the chief architect. He sneered, an expression that did not suit his boyish, over-moisturized face. You're just hoarding information because you're scared we're going to find out your precious engine is a bunch of if statements with good marketing. Get the signature, Zane. He stormed out, and I already knew, with the certainty of a woman who has read this particular script before, exactly what would happen next. They would not get the signature. Signing a directive like that creates a paper trail, and paper trails create liability. And men like Colton Ashford instinctively avoid liability the way a cat avoids a bathtub, without ever quite understanding why they're avoiding it. Just an animal sense that the water is bad. Instead, they'd try to go around me entirely. Bully a junior engineer. Lean on IT. Find a side door. I opened my private log, the one that lived nowhere Halcyon's IT department could see it, and typed. Date. Event. Zane requested removal of segmented access controls and implementation of single sign-on across the fraud detection environment. Action. Denied, citing Compliance Policy 14. Note. Leadership is actively attempting to circumvent fundamental security protocols. My heart was doing something unpleasant in my chest, but my hands were steady on the keyboard. I felt, honestly, a little bit like a seismologist watching the needle start to twitch before the big one. The specific dread of someone who understands exactly what's coming and can't stop it, only document it thoroughly enough that nobody would ever be able to say they weren't warned. Later that afternoon, I ran into our junior systems administrator, a nervous, sweet kid named Milo, coming out of Colton's office looking like he'd just watched a car accident. I intercepted him by the break room where he was making himself a cup of tea with the concentrated focus of a man trying not to think about something. Milo, I said quietly. He jumped so hard he nearly dropped the mug. What did they ask you to do? He looked over both shoulders like he was checking for Zane specifically. They they want me to reset the environment permissions on the fraud staging server, create an override account for Zane's team so they can push directly without going through your approval queue. Did you do it? Not yet. I told them I need a formal change ticket. It's policy. That buys 24 hours minimum. Good man, I said, and I meant it more than he understood at the time. Milo, listen to me carefully. Whatever they ask you to do from here on, document every single request. Email them back confirming exactly what they told you to do, in writing, and forward the whole thread to your personal account. Do not go down for these people. Is it bad? His voice had the specific pitch of someone who already suspects the answer and doesn't want it confirmed. It's about to be very bad, I said. But it's not going to be your fault, and it's not going to be mine either. Just stall them as long as you can. I'm handling it. I wasn't handling it in the way he thought I meant. I wasn't trying to save the ship. I had, by that point, quietly and thoroughly moved on to checking the lifeboats. I spent the rest of that week doing something that would have looked, to an outside observer, like sulking in my supply closet. It was not sulking. I was auditing my own history, making absolutely sure that every line of the Sentinel Core's original architecture was timestamped, hashed, and version controlled in a way that couldn't be disputed later. I verified the Git history going back to the print shop days. I made sure every commit before Colton's arrival carried my authorship in a way no lawyer could argue around. Zane's team, meanwhile, had gone quiet, which, in my experience, is never a good sign. Quiet in a company being run by people who don't understand what they're running usually means somebody found a side door. They found Milo's replacement, actually. Not a literal replacement, they didn't fire him, they just went around him, the way water finds a crack in a foundation instead of knocking down the wall. Zane brought in 3 of his own guys, poached from whatever was left of the crypto exchange he used to work at, and by Thursday of the following week they had, through what I can only describe as sheer bullying momentum, gotten a staging deployment pushed live. On a Tuesday morning. At market open, if we're being generous and calling retail checkout volume a market, which in payments processing functionally it is. I want you to sit with that for a second because if you've ever worked anywhere near financial infrastructure, you already know how insane this is. You do not deploy untested changes to a live risk engine during your highest traffic window. You deploy on a Friday evening, and you spend the weekend nervously refreshing your dashboards, praying nothing catches fire while traffic is low enough that a mistake costs you thousands instead of millions. Zane's team deployed at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, 3 hours before the biggest retail partner on our network launched a flash sale they'd been promoting for 2 weeks. I was watching the real-time dashboard on my second monitor, old habit. I'd built that dashboard myself years ago, and checking it had become as automatic as breathing. At 9:41 a.m., the authorization latency line, which usually sat as a flat, boring, beautiful green hump near the bottom of the graph, spiked. Not catastrophically at first. A few milliseconds here, a few there. To a human being, a few milliseconds means nothing. You couldn't perceive it if you tried. To a fraud engine processing $11 billion a year, a few milliseconds is the exact gap a stolen card needs to slip through before the system finishes deciding it's stolen. By 10:15, the false decline rate had started climbing, legitimate customers getting rejected at checkout because the new, streamlined risk model was choking on load it had never been tested against. By 11 o'clock, the fraud approval rate, the metric that measures how many actually stolen cards we were letting through, had ticked up for the first time in 3 years. By 1:30 in the afternoon, Halcyon was down $400,000 in confirmed fraud losses on a single retail partner's flash sale, plus an unknowable, much larger figure in lost revenue from customers whose legitimate purchases had been wrongly declined and who, understandably, were not going to try that retailer again anytime soon. I could see Colton's office from the far end of the floor. Glass walls, very modern, very transparent, ironically. He was on the phone, red-faced, gesturing with the specific violence of a man who has just learned that expensive things can also be fragile. Zane was pacing outside his own team's cluster of desks, and his three poached crypto guys were typing frantically at their laptops with the kind of theatrical urgency you usually only see in movies about hacking. The ones where someone yells, "I'm in," for no reason. At 2:15, the summons came. Colton's assistant, a woman who I swear had aged visibly in the 3 weeks since he'd arrived, appeared at the mouth of my supply closet. "They need you in the main conference room, now." I walked in slowly. I want you to understand this was a choice. When you know exactly how a scene is going to end, there is no reason to rush toward it. The room smelled like burnt coffee and the specific sour tang of expensive cologne mixed with flop sweat. Colton had sweated clean through the back of his shirt. Zane looked like he might genuinely be sick on the conference table. "Fix it," Colton barked, not even looking up. "Fix what?" I asked, taking the seat at the far end of the table, folding my hands like I had all the time in the world, because I did. "I thought this was the disruption you wanted. Isn't this the buzz?" "Don't get cute with me, Dana. Latency's through the roof. We're bleeding cash on every partner feed, and Zane's telling me it's your legacy code conflicting with the new modules." I looked directly at Zane, who found something extremely interesting to study on the surface of the conference table. "Is that right? My code, which hasn't been touched in 8 months, decided to spontaneously conflict today, the exact day your team pushed an unauthorized patch?" "Your architecture is spaghetti," Zane snapped, the fastest possible pivot to deflection I'd ever personally witnessed. "It's not compatible with modern auth standards. It's rejecting legitimate API calls because you built it proprietary and hostile on purpose." "I built it fast and secure," I said. "You're trying to bolt an off-the-shelf spoiler onto a fighter jet with duct tape, and you're stunned the aerodynamics are off." "Just disable the old authentication handshake," Zane said. And I want you to notice the exact moment his voice changed, because I certainly did. "That's what's eating the latency. The system's re-verifying device fingerprint and session integrity on every single call because of how paranoid the original build is. If we cut the internal handshake, we get the speed back immediately." The room went very still. Colton looked between the two of us. "Can we do that?" "Can you?" I asked, keeping my voice terrifyingly professionally flat. "Technically, yes. You could strip the internal verification layer entirely. It would act like a shot of adrenaline for about 10 minutes before everything downstream starts failing in ways you can't predict." "Then do it," Colton ordered. "I won't. This is insubordination." "No," I said. "This is risk management, which is the entire reason you're paying me a salary. If you strip the authentication handshake, you leave the fraud engine wide open to injection attacks. And more importantly," I let the pause sit there, weighed it like a stone in my palm, "you would be fundamentally altering the security architecture of the system." "I don't care about the architecture. I care about the P&L. Colton stood, jaw tight. "Zane, can you do it without her?" Zane hesitated, just long enough for the hesitation itself to be an answer. I think so. I'd need the master encryption key. Dana has it." Colton's eyes came back to me, and for the first time since I'd met him, They weren't glassy. They were something closer to desperate. Give him the key, Dana. No, you're fired if you don't. Then fire me, I said, standing, smoothing my blazer. And I walk out of this building with every ounce of institutional knowledge about where every one of your vulnerabilities is buried, and you have nobody left who knows how to fix what you're about to break. Or you cannot fire me, and I still won't hand over the key, and you can go ahead and figure out how to break the lock yourselves. I'm not handing anyone the crowbar. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a small, unremarkable silver drive. Not the drive, a decoy, a dummy, loaded with nothing but old configuration files and a document titled, with a candor I'm still proud of, Why You Should Not Do This. I set it on the table between us, more theater than substance, and I walked out. Nobody stopped me. I want to be honest, I think they were a little bit afraid of me by that point, and they had absolutely no idea yet how correct that fear was. They didn't fire me. They were too rattled. But I knew, with the same certainty I'd had watching that latency graph twitch, exactly what they were going to try next. They were desperate, and desperation, in my experience, is the single most reliable engine of catastrophically stupid decisions ever invented. I went back to my supply closet and opened my monitoring suite. But I wasn't watching the market anymore. I was watching the system logs, specifically the integrity checks on the core security kernel, the layer of the Sentinel core that governed authentication, encryption, and the handshake protocol Zane so badly wanted gone. I set a script running on my personal, air-gapped laptop, a simple listener pinging the kernel's integrity hash every 10 seconds. It was quiet, unglamorous work, the kind nobody writes movies about. And I sat there in a windowless, converted supply closet doing it anyway. Because I have never once in my professional life trusted a man who says the words "friction kills innovation" to leave well enough alone once he's been told no. They didn't try again that day. They waited until Thursday evening, which told me they'd at least learned enough to know a weekday market close was safer than a Tuesday morning, though not nearly enough to know the right answer was not to do it at all. I stayed late that night, ostensibly to monitor the transition, which is corporate speak for holding a vigil, watching the building empty out floor by floor until it was just me, the hum of the server room 2 levels down vibrating faintly up through the floor tiles, and the muffled sound of voices coming from Colton's office, where the lights were still on. I could see the server load spiking on my dashboard around 7:20 p.m., a pattern I recognized immediately. Brute force scripts hammering against the internal authentication layer, trying to strip out the handshake I'd built specifically to make this kind of thing impossible to do quietly. They weren't being subtle. They didn't know how to be subtle. Subtlety requires understanding what you're trying to hide from, and they had no idea I was 2 floors down watching every single request land. At 7:42 p.m., the text on my listener window changed color. Ping, secure. Ping, secure. Ping, secure. Ping, alert. Kernel integrity compromised. Core authentication handshake bypassed. Unauthorized elevated privileges detected in production environment. They'd done it. To shave a few hundred milliseconds off their approval times, they had physically, verifiably, irreversibly disabled the core security architecture of the fraud engine, without asking me, without a written directive, without so much as a courtesy email, at 7:42 p.m. on a Thursday, live in production on a system processing $11 billion a year. They had altered the fundamental security protocols without my express written consent. I sat back in my squeaking chair in my windowless closet and let that sentence land the way you let a held breath finally leave your chest. The office was dark, except for the glow of my monitors and the light bleeding out from under Colton's door down the hall, where I could hear what sounded like muted, triumphant cheering, the specific noise men make when they've just done something they believe was clever. They thought they'd fixed the pipe. They had no idea they'd just cut the main line to the water source and flooded the basement of their own house. I didn't celebrate. I want to be clear about that, because in every version of the story I've told at dinner parties, somebody assumes this is the part where I punched the air. I didn't. What I felt instead was a very quiet, very cold click. The specific sensation of a mechanism you built years ago finally engaging exactly the way you designed it to. No drama, no fireworks, just a lock turning. I took a screenshot of the alert, timestamped. I exported the full diff log showing precisely which lines of the security kernel had been changed by which credentials at what second. The change had gone in under an override account tied to Zane's login. Milo's paper trail had done its job perfectly. And I made a mental note to buy that kid the nicest bottle of whiskey his age would legally allow. Then I went to a small fireproof lockbox I kept under my desk, one I'd moved into the supply closet along with everything else, and I took out a physical, printed copy of my employment contract. I laid the printed logs directly on top of Appendix E, Section 7.3, like completing a recipe. It was done. Legally, technically, contractually, as of 7:42 p.m. that Thursday, the intellectual property known as the Sentinel Core no longer belonged to Halcyon Pay. It belonged to me. I felt a strange, low hum in my fingertips that night, driving home, that I initially mistook for adrenaline. It wasn't adrenaline. Adrenaline is what you feel when something dangerous might happen. This was closer to vindication, which is a much quieter, much heavier feeling, one that sits in your chest for days afterward, instead of burning off in an hour. The next morning, the mood on the floor was electric, in the specific way a mood gets electric right before it curdles. Latency was down. The P&L had swung back green for the first time in a week. Colton was strutting between desks like a man who had personally reinvented currency. "See, Dana?" he said, breezing past my supply closet with a grin I can only describe as smug in a way that should be studied clinically. "Zane got it done. Sometimes you gotta break a few eggs to make an omelet." "You certainly broke something, Colton," I said, and offered him the kind of tight, polite smile I reserve for men who are about 11 days away from finding out exactly how much trouble they're in. "We're ready for the pitch," he announced to the floor at large, loud enough for everyone to hear, riding the high of a crisis he thought he'd solved instead of one he'd just detonated the foundation of. "Ridgeline Capital's coming in for the Series C, $250 million on the table. This is the number that gets us to a real valuation." And there it was, the ticking clock I'd been quietly, patiently waiting to hear about for weeks. I want to tell you about Ridgeline Capital because they matter to the ending, and because I need you to understand exactly how much money was about to walk into a room believing they were buying something Halcyon no longer owned. Ridgeline was a growth stage fund with a reputation for writing large, decisive checks fast once they'd committed, and a partner named Marcus Kessler who had, according to every piece of press I'd read about him, a near-obsessive personal habit of reading every word of every diligence document himself, instead of delegating it entirely to associates. A habit that had apparently saved his fund from 2 different disasters in the past 5 years. Colton had been courting Ridgeline for 4 months. The entire pitch deck, which I had seen an early draft of months earlier, back when I was still technically in the loop on strategic decisions, rested almost entirely on the proprietary, unassailable, patent-pending fraud detection advantage of the Sentinel Core. He was about to sell a $250 million stake in a company built on top of technology that, as of 7:42 p.m. the previous Thursday, he no longer legally owned. At lunch that Friday, I walked 2 blocks to a sandwich shop I liked specifically because the walls were thick enough that nobody from the office ever ate there, and I called my lawyer. Renata Cole was not the kind of attorney you call for a friendly chat. She was the kind of attorney you call when you're about to do something that requires absolute precision. A woman who spoke in complete, structured sentences even when discussing what she wanted for dinner, and who had, in the past, described her own approach to negotiation as patient, then sudden. "It happened," I said, watching Colton pace behind the glass wall of his office 2 blocks away, visible even from the sandwich shop's window if you knew exactly which pane to look through, which I did, because I'd been watching that office for weeks by then. "Do you have the logs?" "I have the logs, the original time-stamped contract, the diff file showing exactly what was changed and under whose credentials, and a paper trail of written warnings going back 3 weeks stating explicitly that this exact change would trigger the reversion clause." Beautiful. I could hear something shift in her voice, the specific satisfaction of a professional watching a plan come together exactly on schedule. "I'll start drafting the formal notice of reversion now. When do you want to serve it?" "Not yet," I said. "They've got a due diligence meeting with Ridgeline Capital in 9 days. $250 million, and the entire valuation is built on IP they no longer own." There was a pause on the line, and then Renata laughed, a short, sharp sound I'd only ever heard from her twice before, both times right before she did something devastating to an opposing counsel. "You want them standing at the altar." "I want them standing at the altar in front of the person writing the biggest check of their careers before anybody objects to the wedding." "Cold," she said, and I could hear the smile in it. "I love it. Don't sign anything in the meantime. Don't verbally agree to anything, even casually, even in a hallway. Don't touch a single line of production code. Don't fix a single bug. Don't do them a single favor, no matter how small, no matter how much they beg. From this point forward, you are legally, functionally a ghost. You show up, you do your job description exactly as written, and you let them walk directly into the wall they built themselves." I hung up and walked back into the building, and I want to be honest, the lobby felt different to me after that call. The logo on the wall, a stylized glowing H that Colton had personally commissioned a rebrand agency to design 6 weeks into his tenure at a cost I happen to know was north of $400,000, looked, for the first time, less like a corporate crest and more like a tombstone waiting for its dates. I rode the elevator up with 2 junior account managers who were discussing, in the specific hushed excitement of people counting money that isn't theirs yet, what they were going to do with their equity once the Ridgeline round closed. One of them mentioned a boat. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing hard enough to hurt. Back at my desk, I opened a terminal window and typed a single command: archiving a complete, verified, cryptographically signed copy of the Sentinel Core's pre-compromise architecture, the last clean version, the one that generated the 81% fraud reduction Colton was about to pitch to a room full of investors as his company's crown jewel. I wasn't taking my personal files with me. I was taking the house, board by board, and putting it somewhere they'd never think to look, which, as it happens, turned out to be an unmarked, brushed steel drive small enough to fit in a coat pocket, sitting quietly in my desk drawer for the next 9 days, like a loaded gun nobody in the building knew was pointed at them. Corporate collapse, in my experience, is never actually sudden. Everyone likes to describe these things afterward as if the walls came down in a single dramatic instant. But the truth is, it has a sound, and the sound is quiet, almost domestic. The specific hush of hallway conversations that stop the moment someone walks by. The sudden closing of laptop lids. The way people start taking the stairs instead of sharing an elevator with someone they used to eat lunch with. By the following Monday, the whispering had started. I noticed it first with Owen Voss, our mid-level compliance officer, a rumpled, perpetually tired man who was, as far as I could tell, one of maybe 4 people in the entire building who actually read the regulatory filings instead of skimming the summary somebody else's assistant had prepared. Owen had a habit of drinking green tea out of a paper cup like it was the only warm thing left in a very cold building, and he stopped by my supply closet on Monday afternoon holding one, looking like a man who'd been sitting with a bad feeling for several days and finally needed to say it out loud to someone. "Dana," he said, leaning against the fabric wall of my doorway, "can I ask you something hypothetical?" "I love hypotheticals, Owen. They're basically lies wearing a nicer outfit." That got a tired laugh out of him. Hypothetically, if a company materially altered its core security architecture without documented authorization from the person legally designated to authorize that kind of change, and that architecture happened to be the entire basis of an upcoming valuation event, what would that do to the deal? I looked at him for a long moment, weighing exactly how much to say, and decided, given everything, that Owen deserved at least a partial truth, because unlike almost everyone else in the building, Owen had never once been anything but decent to me. "Hypothetically," I said, "it would depend entirely on who owned the architecture at that point." Owen's eyes narrowed slightly, the look of a man doing math he didn't love the answer to. "You have something in your contract." "I have a lot of things in my contract, Owen. Most people don't read the appendices." "I read the appendices," he said quietly. "It's sort of my whole job." He didn't push further, which I respected enormously, and he left with his tea going cold in his hand, but I noticed, over the following days, that his risk reports started flagging the exact anomaly Zane's team had introduced, in careful, bloodless compliance language that would look, to anyone reading it later in a discovery process, exactly like what it was, a paper trail nobody in leadership had bothered to read. The other near miss came 4 days before the Ridgeline meeting, and it genuinely almost derailed everything. I was in the small kitchenette on the second floor, refilling my water bottle, when I overheard Zane and one of his poached crypto guys, I never did learn his actual name, everyone just called him the Beard, talking in low voices near the printer. "She hasn't said a word about the off-layer change, though," the Beard was saying. "You'd think she'd be losing her mind." "She's probably just sulking in her closet," Zane said. "Whatever, as long as she doesn't do anything before Ridgeline signs." "You don't think she'd, sabotage it? Before the meeting?" There was a pause, and I stood very still behind the refrigerator, my heart doing something unpleasant against my ribs, because if Zane's brain, against all odds, managed to connect 2 dots in the correct order, 9 days of patient waiting could unravel in about 4 seconds. "Nah," Zane finally said, with the specific overconfidence of a man who has never once in his life been wrong in a way that mattered to him personally. "She's too much of a Boy Scout. She'll write a strongly worded memo and then do exactly what she's told, like always. People like her always fold eventually." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and walked out of the kitchenette with my water bottle, unbothered, unremarkable, exactly the Boy Scout he believed me to be. And I want you to sit with the specific, delicious irony of that moment for a second, because Zane Kowalski, a man who used the word synergy as a verb, had just correctly identified the single largest miscalculation of his entire professional life, and then talked himself right back out of believing it. I spent the rest of that week doing precisely nothing suspicious. I answered tickets, I attended the mandatory all hands where Colton unveiled a new company mission statement involving the word frictionless 4 separate times. I nodded along in meetings I had no real stake in anymore. I let Zane's team believe, completely, that the woman who had built the fortress had simply given up defending it, because the version of me that had given up was infinitely more useful to my actual plan than the version of me that looked like a threat. Renata called twice that week, mostly to confirm I hadn't broken and fixed anything for them out of habit. I hadn't, though I won't pretend it didn't itch, watching false decline complaints from partner retailers pile up in a queue I was no longer authorized to touch, and once to walk me through exactly what would happen in the room when the notice finally dropped. Timing matters more than almost anything else in a case like this, she told me. Too early and they scramble a fix, buy an emergency license, paper over the gap before the investor ever sees it. Too late and the money's already wired, and unwinding a closed deal is 10 times harder than stopping one from closing in the first place. You want the exact moment where the check is in the room but the ink isn't dry. How will I know when that is? You'll know, she said. Trust me, you'll feel it. She was right. I did. The morning of the Ridgeline meeting, Halcyon's main conference room had been transformed into something that looked less like a workplace and more like a stage set, built by someone who'd once seen a movie about Silicon Valley and taken careful notes. Fresh flowers on the credenza, a tray of pastries from the expensive bakery 3 blocks over that Colton normally reserved for board meetings, a slide deck projected on the wall in 60-point font, the words Sentinel Core, proprietary, unassailable, yours, glowing behind the head of the conference table like a promise nobody in that room but me knew was already broken. I had been invited, somewhat reluctantly, at Owen's quiet insistence. He'd apparently told Colton that no serious technical diligence could happen without the actual architect of the system in the room, which was true, and which Colton, in his rush to close the biggest check of his life, hadn't thought to question. I sat near the far end of the table, in a plain navy blazer, with nothing in front of me but a legal pad, a pen, and, in my blazer pocket, a small unmarked drive of brushed steel that I had, at that point, been carrying for 4 days like a woman carrying a verdict she already knew the ending of. Marcus Kessler arrived at 10 sharp with 2 associates, and I understood within about 90 seconds of watching him why Ridgeline's reputation for thoroughness wasn't just marketing. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, dressed with the specific understated quality of a man who has never once needed to prove he had money, and he carried a slim leather folder under one arm that he did not open right away, choosing instead to simply listen closely to Colton's opening pitch, nodding at the right moments in a way that told me nothing at all about what he was actually thinking. Colton was, credit where it's due, a genuinely gifted talker. He walked Kessler through Halcyon's growth numbers, the client roster, the 81% fraud reduction figure, my figure, from my architecture, presented with the easy confidence of a man who had personally built it with his own 2 hands. And by the time he reached the technical section of the deck, the room had the specific warm, self-congratulatory energy of a deal everyone in it believed was already closed in every way that mattered except the wire transfer. The Sentinel Core is what makes this company defensible, Colton said, clicking to a slide showing a simplified, cartoonish diagram of the fraud engine's architecture, the kind you make for investors who don't actually want to see real code. Proprietary technology, 6 years of development, fully owned by Halcyon Pay outright. No licensing dependencies, no third-party risk. This is our moat. I appreciate that, Kessler said, finally opening the leather folder in front of him, and I felt the temperature of the room shift, subtly, the way a kitchen changes the moment someone actually turns the oven on instead of just preheating it. Our diligence team flagged a few items in the IP documentation I'd like to walk through, if that's all right. Standard process, nothing alarming, just due diligence. Of course, Colton said, and I watched him glance very briefly toward the general counsel seated 2 chairs down. Not Whitfield, who'd retired the year before, but his replacement, a sharp, exhausted-looking woman named Priya Nair, who had joined Halcyon only 4 months earlier and, I suspected, had absolutely no idea what she was about to walk into. Your employment agreements list a chief architect of fraud systems as the named inventor of record on several internal patent filings, Kessler said, tapping a page in his folder. Standard work for hire language in Section 4.2. But I'm looking at an appendix here, Appendix E, Section 7.3, that I don't think our associates flagged clearly enough in the summary memo. He looked up, directly at Priya. Can someone walk me through this clause? It appears to describe a reversion condition. The room went very still. I kept my eyes on my legal pad, my pen resting lightly against the page, and I let the silence do exactly the work I'd spent 9 days waiting for it to do. Priya flipped through the physical copy in front of her, her eyes moving quickly, the specific, rapid scan of a lawyer realizing in real time that she is standing in the middle of a minefield she did not personally plant. This appears to be a reversion of ownership clause tied to alterations of the security architecture, she said slowly. I'd need to review the full context before... Has the security architecture of the fraud engine been altered in the past several weeks? Kessler asked, and his voice hadn't risen at all, hadn't sharpened. He simply asked it the way you'd ask someone what time it was, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted. Nobody answered right away. Zane, who had been invited to the meeting specifically to speak to the modernization roadmap, suddenly found the pastry tray extremely interesting. Colton's jaw tightened, and I watched, with something close to professional admiration, the exact moment his brain arrived at the fork in the road between the truth and a lie, and chose the lie, the way I'd known he would from the very first day he sat uninvited on the edge of my desk. There's been some routine optimization work, Colton said. Standard modernization, nothing that touches ownership. It's not routine, Priya said quietly, still reading, and I could hear in her voice the specific sound of a general counsel realizing her career had just quietly ended in a conference room she hadn't chosen the furniture for. This language is extremely specific. It defines fundamental security protocols by name and requires express written consent from a named individual. If those protocols were altered without that consent, it's just legal boilerplate, Colton snapped, cutting her off, his composure fraying at the exact rate I'd expected it to. It doesn't mean anything real. We paid her salary for 6 years. We own everything she built. That's not actually what the document says, Kessler said, tapping the page again with 2 fingers, unhurried, almost gentle, the way you'd correct a child who'd gotten a simple fact wrong. He turned finally to me, for the first time directing a question my way instead of speaking around me like furniture. Ms. Reyes, do you currently hold personal ownership of the Sentinel Core's architecture? I do, I said. And do you have any current licensing agreement in place with Halcyon Pay permitting their continued use of it? I do not. Kessler closed the leather folder. It made a small, precise sound in the quiet room, the specific finality of a door latching shut. Well, he said, to the table at large, in the tone of a man delivering a piece of weather news. That complicates the valuation considerably. You can't listen to her, Colton said, and his voice had climbed half an octave, the sound of a man watching $250 million evaporate in real time and beginning, physically, to panic about it. She's bluffing. The code is on our servers. It's in our infrastructure. It's ours. Is it, though? I asked. It was the first full sentence I'd spoken since the meeting began, and I let it sit there for a second before I reached into my blazer pocket and set the small, brushed steel drive on the polished mahogany table, directly in the middle of everyone's sightline. It made a small, precise, almost delicate clacking sound against the wood, and I watched every single person at that table look at it like it might detonate, which, in a sense, it already had. "The code currently running on your production servers," I said to Colton, keeping my voice level and unhurried, "is the compromised version. The one your modernization team broke when they bypassed the internal authentication handshake 9 days ago at 7:42 p.m. on a Thursday without my knowledge, without a written directive, and without my consent. It technically works, for now, but it's leaking risk exposure with every transaction it processes, and it is, as of that exact moment, legally compromised as well as technically compromised, which I'd imagine matters quite a bit to the man across the table who is about to wire you $250 million. I nodded toward the drive. This contains the last clean, verified, cryptographically signed version of the Sentinel core. The version that generated the 81% fraud reduction in the deck you just pitched. And per Appendix E, Section 7.3 of my employment agreement, that source logic, all of it, currently belongs to me. The room had the specific frozen quality of a photograph, a tableau of very expensive suits arranged around a very simple, very devastating fact. Kessler looked at the drive, then at Colton, with an expression I can only describe as clinical curiosity, the look of a man watching a controlled demolition from a safe distance. "Is she telling the truth, Colton? Does she actually hold the source?" "It doesn't matter," Colton said, and I watched, almost with pity, the exact moment the polished, buzzword-fluent CEO facade cracked straight down the middle, revealing the same spoiled, cornered boy who'd sat uninvited on my desk 8 weeks earlier. "She stole it. That's theft. That's corporate espionage. It's my possession, under a contract your own company's former counsel signed and your own current counsel is holding in her hands right now," I said, calm, unbothered, letting each word land at its own pace. "I left the compromised version running on your servers. You're welcome to it. Good luck explaining to the SEC and to your payment network partners why your fraud detection system's compliance filters were quietly removed 9 days before a funding round, without documentation, without a change management approval, and without so much as an internal risk memo." Kessler stood, unhurried, buttoning his suit jacket with the specific finality of a man who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for his body to catch up to it. His 2 associates rose with him, in near-perfect unison, a small choreography of professional rejection that I found, in the moment, almost beautiful to watch. "Colton," Kessler said, "we can't move forward with this. IP ownership is in active dispute. The security architecture underlying your core product has been materially compromised, and, frankly, your risk management process, based on what I've heard in the last 10 minutes, appears to be effectively non-existent." "Wait!" Colton actually scrambled, there's no more elegant word for it, around the length of the table toward Kessler, his composure entirely gone now, replaced by the specific flailing energy of a man watching his entire adult identity collapse in real time. "We can fix this. We can get an injunction. We can sue her for the source. We can—" "I'm not putting $250 million into a company that's about to be the defendant in an IP lawsuit it will very obviously lose," Kessler said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "I came here to buy a well-engineered car. You tried to sell me a stolen one with the brake lines cut." He turned to me and gave me a small nod. The kind of quiet, professional respect I don't think I'd ever actually received from anyone in that building until that exact moment. Ms. Reyes, if you ever decide to license this technology to a company that actually reads its own contracts, my card's on the table. I'll keep that in mind, I said, and meant it more than he probably realized. Kessler and his associates walked out. The door clicked shut behind them with a sound that felt, in that room, disproportionately loud. The specific silence that follows a door closing on $250 million, carrying enough weight to crush something structural. Colton stood facing the closed door, his back to the table, his shoulders rising and falling in a way that told me he was doing everything in his power not to actually be sick in front of everyone. Zane had slid so far down in his chair, he looked like he was trying to physically dissolve into the upholstery, which, given everything, I thought was probably the correct instinct. Priya Nair sat with her fingers pressed against her temples, visibly recalculating the entire trajectory of a job she'd held for 4 months and was clearly beginning to understand she should never have accepted. Then Colton turned around, and his face had rearranged itself into something I can only describe as a rictus of pure, undiluted, infantile rage. The specific expression of a man who has never once in his life been told no by consequences and is encountering the sensation for the very first time. "You," he said, and his voice actually cracked in the middle of the single syllable. "You did this. You planned this." "I'm a professional, Colton," I said, standing, gathering my legal pad. "There's a difference." "I'll destroy you," he shouted. And I want you to know that spit genuinely, actually flew from his mouth on that sentence, which is a detail I did not expect to get to include in this story, but here we are. "I'll bury you in legal fees so deep you'll never work in this industry again. You'll be radioactive. Nobody will touch you." "No, you won't," Priya said quietly, from the side of the table, not even looking up from the contract in front of her, and Colton's head snapped toward her like she'd slapped him. "Whose side are you even on?" "I'm on the side of not committing malpractice," Priya said, with the specific weariness of a woman who has clearly decided, in the last 90 seconds, that this job is no longer worth whatever they're paying her. "She has us dead to rights, Colton. Appendix E is airtight. Whitfield's language, ironically, is some of the cleanest drafting I've seen in this entire employment file. If we sue her, we lose. And in discovery, every log of Zane's team bypassing the security architecture becomes public record. The payment network partners will see it. The SEC will see it. This isn't a fight we survive. It's a fight that ends the company." Colton looked at Priya, then at Zane, then back at me, and I watched the full weight of it land on him all at once. The money gone, the reputation gone, the toy he'd taken a hammer to broken beyond any repair he was capable of, personally or financially. His eyes landed on the drive still sitting on the table, and something in him snapped in a very specific, very stupid direction. He lunged for it. I didn't move to stop him. I let him grab it, watched him hold it up over his head like a trophy he'd actually won something for, chest heaving. "I have it," he said, breathless, half laughing in a way that had nothing to do with actual amusement. "I have the code. I have it right here." "It's encrypted," I said. AES 256. With a key phrase that exists in exactly one place, which is not anywhere in this building. You can hold that drive until the sun burns out, and it will never once give you anything but a piece of metal. And before you ask, no, you cannot brute force it. I wrote the encryption myself, specifically to be unbreakable by the kind of person who thinks brute force is a strategy instead of a symptom. He stared at the drive in his hand like it had personally betrayed him. His knuckles white around it, understanding in real time that it was the only leverage he had left in the entire room, and that he had absolutely no way to use it. "What do you want?" he finally choked out, and it wasn't really a question. It was closer to a surrender. "Just, what do you want?" I set my legal pad down on the table, unhurried, and I looked around that boardroom one final time. The wilting flowers, the untouched pastries, the 60-point font on the wall still glowing with a promise that had expired roughly 11 minutes earlier. "I want a few things," I said, "and I want them in writing, countersigned by the board, before I say another word about licensing anything back to this company." "Name it," Colton said, and there was something almost pathetic in how fast the fight had drained out of him, the way a man deflates once he realizes the room has already decided against him, and the only thing left to negotiate is how badly he loses. "You step down as CEO. Not a leave of absence, not a sabbatical, not a rebrand into some invented title like Chief Vision Officer. You step down effective immediately, and the board installs interim leadership from outside your direct reports until a permanent replacement is found. You can't dictate my own company's leadership. I can dictate the terms under which I'm willing to license the technology that makes your company solvent," I said, cutting him off with the same flat, unhurried tone I'd used the entire meeting. Because I'd learned a long time ago that volume is what people reach for when they've run out of actual leverage, and I still had plenty left. "If you want the engine that makes the money, you play by my rules. If you'd rather not, I hear Ridgeline is still in the market for a payments infrastructure play, and Marcus Kessler left his card on the table on his way out." "You can't do that," Colton said, but it came out thin now, more of a question than a statement, a man checking to see if reality had any give left in it. It didn't. "Second," I continued, "Zane Kowalski is terminated, for cause effective today, with a documented record specifying that his team's unauthorized modification of the security architecture is the direct cause of the reversion and the collapse of this funding round. I want that in the termination file, not a quiet, generous severance and an NDA. For cause." Zane, still half sunk into his chair, made a small, strangled noise that I chose not to dignify with eye contact. "Third," I said, "any consulting agreement going forward is priced at $800 an hour, with a minimum monthly retainer, and includes full editorial control over any future modification to the security architecture. No exceptions, no override authority granted to anyone outside my sign-off, regardless of title. I built one loophole into a contract once already. I'm not leaving room for a second." "You're extorting us," Colton said, and I watched him reach for the last available emotion in his arsenal, the wounded, aggrieved outrage of a man who genuinely, on some level, believed the rules were only ever meant to apply to other people. "I'm licensing you back access to intellectual property that is, contractually and now publicly, mine," I said. "The word you're looking for is business." He stood there for a long moment, still clutching the useless drive in one white-knuckled fist, and something in his face finally completely cracked open. The last thin membrane between the polished air and the furious child underneath giving way all at once. "I own you," he said, and his voice had gone somewhere I hadn't heard it go before, high and raw and genuinely unhinged. "I own you and everything you've ever built here. I am Halcyon. Do you understand me? I am this company." It was, I remember thinking in the moment, the exact sound of a king discovering his throne had been made of cardboard the entire time, standing in the wreckage of a coronation he'd thrown for himself before anyone else had agreed to it. "You don't own me, Colton," I said, quiet, almost gentle, because there was no need left to raise my voice. The argument had already ended several minutes earlier, and only he hadn't noticed yet. And as of 9 days ago, you don't even own the thing you just tried to sell for $250 million. You own a company with a compromised production environment, an active IP dispute, a failed funding round, and a burn rate that's about to get very interesting to explain to your remaining investors. I walked to the table and held out my hand, palm open. "The drive, please." He clutched it tighter against his chest, actually took a step backward, the way a toddler protects a toy he's already been told he can't keep. "No." "Okay," I said, and shrugged, and meant it, because the drive had never actually been the point. "Keep it. It's a paperweight, without the key, and I'm the only person alive who has the key. I have the master backup, I have the encryption phrase memorized, and I have a signed, notarized, time-stamped contract that Ridgeline Capital's own outside counsel just watched hold up in real time in front of witnesses. You holding on to a piece of metal changes exactly nothing." I turned to Priya, who looked like a woman doing complicated math about her own resignation letter in real time. "Have your office reach out to my attorney, Renata Cole, to begin drafting the licensing terms. I'd suggest doing it before the board finds out what happened in this room secondhand instead of from you directly." Then I picked up my legal pad and I walked out of the boardroom, and I did not look back, though I did hear, fading behind me down the hallway, Colton shouting something about loyalty and betrayal and everything he'd been promised, the words getting smaller and smaller with distance until they sounded, honestly, like a dog barking 3 streets over. The kind of noise you register and then simply stop listening to. I took the elevator to the lobby alone, which felt appropriate, and I want to tell you honestly that I did not feel triumphant walking through those glass doors into the parking lot. I felt something quieter and, in its own way, heavier. The specific exhaustion that comes after holding something coiled and ready for 9 straight days, and finally letting it go. It was early autumn, one of those crisp Colorado mornings where the light comes in at a low gold angle and everything looks a little more honest than usual. And I stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, just breathing air that didn't smell like burnt coffee and cologne. My phone buzzed before I'd even made it to my car. A text from Owen. "Everyone's talking. Priya just walked into the boardroom with the board chair. Colton's assistant is crying at her desk. Is it true?" I typed back, every word. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, the specific rhythm of someone drafting and deleting several different responses before settling on, "Buy you a drink tonight? You've earned it." Also, I may have already forwarded my last 6 risk memos to the board's audit committee this morning. Timing seemed right. I actually laughed out loud, standing alone on the sidewalk, which earned me a strange look from a man walking his dog. Owen Voss, mild-mannered, green tea drinking, appendix reading Owen Voss, had apparently decided to make his own quiet, well-documented move at the exact same moment I made mine, and I found that detail, honestly, more satisfying than almost anything that had happened in the boardroom. A second text came in, this one from Milo. "Heard what happened from Owen. Holy sh*! Are you okay? Also, do you think I could put you down as a reference? I don't think I want to work here anymore either." "Absolutely," I typed back. "Call me Monday. And Milo, thank you for the paper trail. It mattered more than you know." I drove home instead of going back into the building, which I understand, in retrospect, made me look either supremely confident or completely reckless, depending on who you ask. But I genuinely didn't have anything left to do there that day. The lawyers would handle the next part. I had spent 9 days being patient, and patience, once it's finally paid off, has a way of making the following few hours feel almost anticlimactic. like standing in the quiet after a fireworks show ends. The fallout, once it started, moved faster than even Renata had predicted. By that Friday afternoon, word had reached every major fintech trade publication that Halcyon Pay's Series C with Ridgeline Capital had collapsed at the 11th hour over an intellectual property dispute, though nobody outside the company yet had the specific, delicious details of what exactly had gone wrong, which meant the speculation online was, for about 72 hours, significantly more entertaining than the truth, if somewhat less accurate. One post on a fintech forum theorized the collapse was due to a data breach. Another guessed regulatory trouble. A third, closer than anyone realized, simply wrote, "Sounds like somebody at Halcyon didn't read their own contracts," which I screenshotted and sent to Renata with no additional commentary, because some things don't need one. The strangest moment of that entire week came on Saturday morning, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, international country code, and I almost let it go to voicemail before some instinct made me pick up. Dana, the voice was older, warmer than I expected, with the specific gravel that comes from a man who has recently discovered he's allowed to sleep past 6 a.m. for the first time in 30 years. It's Walter. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. "Walter, I honestly didn't expect to hear from you." "I imagine not," he said, and I could hear, faintly, what sounded like birds in the background, somewhere green and quiet and very far from a boardroom. "Priya called me yesterday. As a courtesy, I think, or possibly out of sheer desperation for someone to talk to who wasn't either crying or shouting. She told me everything. The security bypass, the reversion clause, ridgeline walking, all of it." I braced myself, honestly, for anger. Some version of the same wounded, proprietary fury I'd watched consume his son in that conference room. What I got instead was a long pause, and then something I hadn't expected at all. "I want to apologize to you," Walter said. "You don't need to." "I do, actually. I built that company for 30 years on the principle that you hire people smarter than you in the areas you don't understand, and then you get out of their way. I forgot to make sure my son understood that principle before I handed him the keys. I was so relieved to be done, so tired, that I didn't ask the questions I should have asked before I left. What happened to you, what he did, that's on me as much as it's on him. Maybe more." He exhaled, and I could hear, in it, the specific weight of a man reassessing 30 years of decisions in real time. "For what it's worth, I never read that clause when Whitfield sent me the renewal summaries every year. I trusted you enough not to look. I still think that was the right instinct. I just wish I'd trusted my son a little less." I didn't know what to say to that, so for a moment I said nothing at all, and Walter, to his credit, let the silence sit without rushing to fill it. "He's going to lose the CEO title," Walter finally said. "The board's already moving on it, I hear. For what it's worth, I'm not going to fight that. I built Halcyon to survive me. I'd like it to survive him too, and right now the only person who seems capable of making sure of that is you." "I already told them my terms," I said. "I know. Priya read me the list." A dry, tired laugh. $800 an hour, full editorial control, and Colton demoted to a chair he can't touch anything from. I think, honestly, it's more generous than I would have offered in your position. I don't need to destroy the company to make my point, Walter. I just needed everyone in it to finally understand who actually built the thing they'd been arguing about. "They understand now," he said. "Believe me. Take care of yourself, Dana, and take care of Sentinel. It's the best thing that ever came out of that print shop. And God knows it wasn't me." The board called an emergency session the following Tuesday, and though I wasn't in the room for it, I was, at that point, technically still an employee on paper, not yet a licensor, and Renata had advised me in no uncertain terms to stay far away from any internal governance meeting until my new status was formalized in writing, I got the full account from Owen that evening over the drink he'd promised me, delivered with the specific relish of a man who had spent 6 years being the only person in a building who actually cared about compliance and was finally, for one afternoon, being listened to. According to Owen, the meeting lasted just under 2 hours, and by his account, it was less a debate than a formality, the board having already, independently, reached the same conclusion I had weeks earlier, that Colton Ashford, whatever his last name meant to the founding story of the company, could not be allowed anywhere near operational decision-making again. The vote to remove him as CEO was, Owen said, uncomfortably unanimous, including, notably, 2 board members who had personally recommended him for the role 8 weeks earlier, and clearly wished, by that point, they could quietly edit that recommendation out of the minutes. He was offered, and accepted, a non-executive chairman title, a soft landing engineered mostly to avoid the kind of ugly, public ousting that tends to spook remaining investors and clients, the corporate equivalent of easing someone out a side door instead of frog-marching them through the lobby. It came with a salary, a title with no actual authority attached to it, and, per the terms I'd personally insisted on through Renata, a contractual prohibition on Colton having any direct communication with me, or any member of my team, or any input whatsoever on decisions involving the Sentinel Core's architecture, security protocols, or licensing terms ever again, for as long as the licensing agreement remained active. Zane's termination, by contrast, was neither soft nor quiet. He was walked out that same Tuesday afternoon by building security, escorted past the desks of the very team he'd spent 8 weeks calling legacy thinkers, carrying a single cardboard box that, Owen told me with visible delight, appeared to contain mostly protein bars and a single framed motivational poster about disruption that someone in the office had apparently already started using as a punchline before he'd even reached the elevator. I want to tell you that I felt some grand, cinematic sense of justice watching all of this unfold secondhand through a series of increasingly gleeful text messages from Owen and Milo. And honestly, I did, a little. But mostly what I felt was relief. The specific, unglamorous relief of watching a genuinely dangerous situation finally, fully resolve itself into something manageable. I hadn't wanted a war. I'd wanted my work protected. And my work, as of that Tuesday, finally was. I should tell you, because leaving it out would be dishonest, and this story deserves the full, ugly texture of what actually happened, that Colton did not go quietly the entire way. 3 days after the board stripped him of his title, before the licensing agreement had been fully executed, I received a call from Renata that began with the words, "So, this is going to be a fun one," which, from Renata, was never actually a compliment. Colton, apparently unwilling to accept that the fight was over, had spent his newly titleless free time hiring an aggressive litigation firm out of New York, the kind that advertises on late-night television and specializes in exactly the sort of scorched earth, delay-everything tactics that men with more money than judgment tend to reach for once they've run out of better ideas. His new lawyers had filed an emergency motion seeking a temporary restraining order to block me from licensing the Sentinel Core to any third party, arguing, with a straight face, according to Renata, who reviewed the filing personally, that Appendix E, Section 7.3 was unconscionable and should be voided on the grounds that I had engineered a trap I always intended to spring. "Did you?" Renata asked me over the phone, and I could hear, underneath the professional neutrality, something that sounded suspiciously like her trying not to laugh. "I engineered a lock," I said. "They picked it themselves." There's a difference, and I'm reasonably confident a judge is going to see it. The judge, it turned out, saw it almost immediately. The hearing lasted less than 40 minutes. Renata later described it to me as one of the shortest, most satisfying oral arguments of my career. Largely because Colton's own general counsel, Priya, still technically employed at that point, still doing her job with the grim, dutiful thoroughness of someone counting down the days until she could leave with a clean conscience, had already turned over the full, time-stamped internal record of every written warning I'd given, every denied access request, every documented refusal to authorize the change that ultimately triggered the reversion. The judge, reviewing a stack of evidence that essentially wrote its own conclusion, denied the restraining order in full, noted in his written opinion that the clause in question was unusually clear and specific for an employment contract appendix, which I have had printed and framed, and ordered Colton's litigation firm to cover a portion of Halcyon's legal costs for what he characterized, generously, as a filing with limited good faith basis. Colton, I'm told, fired that law firm within the week. I don't know what happened to the retainer he'd already paid them. I choose, for my own peace of mind, to assume it was substantial. The final licensing agreement took 6 weeks to fully paper, which is apparently fast by the standards of these things, though it did not feel fast living through it. Renata negotiated it line by line with Halcyon's new interim CEO, a steady, unglamorous operations veteran named Diane Okafor, who the board had pulled out of a semi-retirement in Charlotte specifically because she had zero interest in buzzwords and an actual, documented track record of not breaking things that were already working. I liked her immediately, in the specific, cautious way you learn to like someone after watching 2 consecutive leadership regimes fail spectacularly. The terms, in the end, were exactly what I'd stated in that boardroom, formalized into language dense enough to make even Whitfield proud. Halcyon retained an exclusive license to run the Sentinel Core in production, but I retained full ownership of the underlying source and architecture, along with sole authority over any modification to the security protocols, present or future, regardless of who held what title inside the company. I would consult at $800 an hour, with a guaranteed monthly retainer that, when Diane first read the figure out loud during negotiations, made her go quiet for a full 10 seconds before simply saying, "Understood," in the tone of a woman who had clearly decided the number was, given everything, still cheaper than rebuilding the entire fraud engine from scratch under a new architect who didn't yet exist. I never gave them the source code back outright. I want to be clear about that, because people occasionally ask me this part with a kind of disappointed confusion, as though the ending should have involved me graciously handing the keys back once the villain was gone. I didn't. Diane wasn't the villain, and I liked her fine. But a company is not a person, and a company's institutional memory is short, and its incentives shift with every new hire in a corner office. I had already learned, the expensive way, exactly what happens when the wrong person ends up holding a key they don't understand the weight of. I kept the deed. They rent the horsepower. That arrangement, as far as I'm concerned, is the only version of this story that doesn't eventually repeat itself with someone else's name on the corner office door. I think you deserve a proper accounting of where everyone landed, because I've always found the loose threads at the end of these stories more satisfying than the climax itself. So let me give you the ledger. Milo left Halcyon about 5 weeks after the Ridgeline meeting, and I did, as promised, serve as his reference. He landed a systems administration role at a healthcare data company across town. Better pay, better hours, and, his words, not mine, in a text he sent me on his first day, a boss who has literally never once asked me to remove a security control on a Thursday night. I still get a holiday card from him every December, always signed with some variation of, "Thank you for teaching me to keep receipts," which I have come to consider one of the more meaningful compliments of my professional life. Owen stayed at Halcyon. He was, in fact, promoted, formally, to Director of Risk and Compliance under Diane's new administration, a title that finally matched the actual scope of work he'd been doing for years without the authority to enforce any of it. He still drinks green tea out of paper cups. He still reads every appendix. I have a standing dinner with him roughly once a quarter, and he has, on more than one occasion, tried to get me to consult on a completely unrelated matter simply so he has an excuse to expense the meal, which I allow because I like him and because watching a compliance officer commit minor, harmless expense report fraud out of pure institutional loyalty is, frankly, one of the more wholesome things I've witnessed in corporate America. Priya Nair resigned 4 months after the Ridgeline meeting, not in disgrace, but with the specific, quiet exhaustion of someone who had come to a company expecting to practice law and instead spent her tenure managing the aftermath of 2 consecutive leadership failures she hadn't personally caused. She landed at a mid-sized fintech in Austin, and last I heard, was doing well, and had apparently developed, according to a mutual contact, an extremely thorough personal habit of reading every single appendix in every contract she now touches, twice. Which I choose to take a small, private, entirely justified amount of credit for. Zane Kowalski, as far as I can tell from a distance I have made no effort to close, spent the following year bouncing between 2 more crypto-adjacent ventures, both of which failed in ways that were, based on the trade press coverage I occasionally stumbled across, spectacularly, almost artistically similar to what happened at Halcyon: a modernization push, a bypass security control, a very bad week. I don't take pleasure in that, exactly. I take something closer to a grim anthropological confirmation that some people don't learn from consequences. They simply relocate them. And Colton remained non-executive chairman of Halcyon Pay for just under a year, before the board, in a vote Owen described to me as even more uncomfortably unanimous than the first one, removed him entirely from any affiliation with the company, formalized with a settlement I am contractually not permitted to discuss the specifics of, though I will say the phrase "for cause" appeared in the final paperwork more than once. He is, according to the last piece of information I have any interest in tracking, currently involved in what his very sparse and infrequently updated professional networking profile describes as advising early-stage founders on scaling and disruption strategy. I wish those founders a great deal of luck. And I mean that with a level of sincerity that surprises even me. I want to pause here, because if I don't, this is going to read like a straightforward revenge story. And it isn't. Not really. Not to me. Revenge implies I wanted something to hurt. I didn't. What I wanted, from the very first day Colton Ashford sat uninvited on the edge of my desk and told me my life's work was giving legacy energy, was simply to make sure that the thing I'd built couldn't be destroyed by someone who didn't understand it, no matter how much money or confidence or inherited last name they walked in with. The clause was never a trap in the way his lawyers tried to argue. A trap requires the other party to be doing something reasonable and get caught anyway. What actually happened was closer to a smoke detector going off because someone deliberately set fire to the kitchen curtains while insisting, the entire time, that fire was simply an outdated way of thinking about heat. I've thought a lot in the months since about why Appendix E worked the way it did, and I've come to believe it wasn't really about the legal language at all. even though the legal language mattered enormously in the moment it needed to. It was about understanding, years in advance, exactly what kind of failure was most likely to come for something I'd built. I didn't protect the Sentinel Core from hackers with that clause. I protected it from confidence. Specifically, the very particular, very expensive kind of confidence that comes from never once having been told no by a consequence that mattered. The kind that convinces a 31-year-old man with no relevant experience that 81% fraud reduction is a black box problem rather than a solved one, simply because he can't personally see inside it and nobody's ever made him sit with that discomfort before. If there's a lesson in here for you, and I do think there's a real one buried under all the schadenfreude, it's this. Whatever you build that's actually good, actually load-bearing, is eventually going to attract someone who wants to touch it without understanding it. Not because they're evil, necessarily. Most of them aren't evil. They're just supremely, catastrophically overconfident. And overconfidence, dressed in a good suit, is one of the most dangerous forces in any organization because it never announces itself as a threat. It announces itself as an opportunity, or a modernization, or a pivot. It uses words like streamline and disrupt and unlock, and by the time you realize what it actually wants to unlock is the thing keeping everyone safe, it's usually already got its hand on the lock. The second lesson, the one I actually think matters more, is quieter, and it's this. Protect the thing you build while you still have the leverage to do it, which is almost always earlier than feels necessary and almost always before anyone in the room believes you'll ever need it. I redlined that contract when Halcyon was 19 people in a print shop with a broken furnace, when I had no reason to believe I'd ever need Appendix E for anything other than peace of mind. I wrote it during the calmest, least adversarial period of my entire career. Specifically because I understood that the moment you actually need a protection like that is never the moment you have the standing left to negotiate for it. You ask for the fire extinguisher before the kitchen's on fire. Nobody thinks you're being paranoid at that point. They just think you're being careful. And by the time they realize how careful you actually were, it's already bolted to the wall. 6 months after Ridgeline walked out of that conference room, I started my own small consultancy. Mostly because word had spread, quietly, then not so quietly, through the fintech and payments world about what had happened at Halcyon. And I started getting calls. Not from companies wanting me to build them a new fraud engine from scratch, though a few of those came too. Mostly, oddly, I got calls from other architects, other engineers, other quiet, overworked people who had built something genuinely valuable inside somebody else's company and had started, for the first time, asking themselves an uncomfortable question. What actually happens to my work if the person signing my paychecks changes, or gets replaced by someone with more confidence than sense? I ended up building a small practice around exactly that question. Half of it is still architecture consulting, the actual technical work I've always loved, the kind that keeps me up until 2 a.m. chasing an elegant solution to an ugly problem. But the other half, somewhat to my own surprise, became something closer to contract strategy. Sitting down with brilliant, undervalued engineers and architects, reading their employment agreements line by line, and helping them find, or write, their own version of Appendix E, Section 7.3, before they ever needed it. I hired Milo 8 months in, once his healthcare data job had run its course and he wanted, in his words, to work somewhere that actually reads its own logs. I have 3 people on staff now, and I pay all of them well, and none of them has ever once had to watch someone with a trust fund and a buzzword deck take a hammer to something they spent years building. I still think about that Thursday night sometimes, sitting in my supply closet, watching the text on my listener window turn from green to red. Ping, secure. Ping, secure. Ping, alert. I've replayed it enough times that it's lost some of its edge, the way any story does once you've told it too many times at dinner parties. But every once in a while, usually late, usually with a drink in hand, I get back a flicker of exactly what it felt like in that moment. Not triumph, not really, but something closer to a held breath, finally being allowed to leave the body. I want to end this the way I ended that actual day, because I think it tells you more about who I actually am than anything I could summarize for you afterward. After I walked out of that boardroom, after the elevator, after the texts from Owen and Milo, I did not go home and celebrate. I walked 3 blocks to a quiet bar I liked, the kind of place with dim lighting and a bartender who doesn't ask questions, and I ordered a bourbon, neat. And I sat by the window and watched people hurry past on the sidewalk, all of them chasing something. Money, status, the next thing, the way everyone in that entire industry is always chasing the next thing. And I took a slow sip of a drink that burned clean and hot on the way down, and I let myself for exactly 1 hour feel nothing at all except quiet. They tried to rewrite the rules of a system I'd spent 6 years building, without ever once asking how the system actually worked. They forgot, in their rush to modernize and disrupt and streamline, that I was the one who'd written the rules in the first place, years before any of them had even walked into that building, back when the whole operation ran on a legal pad and a space heater, and nobody with a trust fund had bothered to notice yet. I realize I've told you a lot about the collapse, and not nearly enough about the thing that collapsed underneath it, and I think that's a disservice, because the Sentinel Core deserves better than to just be the MacGuffin in a story about a rich man's ego. So let me back up, all the way back, to the print shop. When I joined Halcyon, the company's fraud detection ran on a rules engine, which is the industry's polite term for a very long, very brittle list of if-then statements bolted together over years by 3 different engineers who'd each left before documenting anything. If a transaction came from a country flagged on a static list, decline it. If a purchase amount exceeded a static threshold, flag it for manual review. It caught the obvious fraud, the lazy fraud, the kind committed by people who hadn't bothered to hide their tracks. It caught almost none of the sophisticated fraud, the kind run by organized rings who understood exactly which static thresholds to stay under. And it declined an embarrassing number of completely legitimate transactions from people who happened to be traveling, or buying something slightly unusual, or simply unlucky enough to trip a rule some engineer had written 4 years earlier and forgotten about. I spent my first 3 months at Halcyon doing almost nothing but reading. Every declined transaction, every confirmed fraud case, every customer complaint about a legitimate purchase getting rejected at the worst possible moment. Standing at a register, humiliated, while a system nobody understood anymore decided their money wasn't real. I built a spreadsheet, genuinely, an actual spreadsheet before any of this became code, mapping out every signal that seemed to correlate with real fraud that the existing rules engine was missing entirely. Device fingerprint drift. The subtle way a device's behavioral profile shifts when it's been compromised or spoofed. Geolocation velocity. The physically impossible speed implied by a card being used in Denver and then 11 minutes later in a country 6 time zones away. Keystroke and interaction cadence during the checkout flow itself. A signal almost nobody in the industry was using yet at the time because it required an entirely different architecture to capture in real time instead of after the fact. The breakthrough, if I can call it that without sounding insufferable, wasn't any single signal. It was the layering, building a system that weighed dozens of quiet, individually unremarkable signals against each other in real time, adjusting its confidence with every additional data point, instead of relying on any single static rule that a sophisticated fraudster could simply learn to avoid. I called the authentication handshake at the center of it the piece Zane's team would eventually strip out, the piece that triggered everything, the trust ladder, because that's genuinely what it did, functionally. It made every device, every session, every transaction climb a series of verification rungs before it earned the system's confidence, rechecking that trust continuously instead of granting it once at login and assuming nothing had changed since. That continuous re-verification was, by a wide margin, the single most computationally expensive part of the entire system, and it was also, by an even wider margin, the entire reason the system worked as well as it did. It's also, I'll note, with a very specific and very justified bitterness, exactly the piece Zane wanted gone because it was eating the latency. He wasn't wrong that it added latency. He was catastrophically wrong about which direction the trade-off actually ran. I remember the first time the system caught something the old rules engine would have missed entirely, back in year 2, a coordinated fraud ring running small, careful purchases across 11 different retail partners simultaneously, each transaction individually unremarkable, each one sitting comfortably under every static threshold anyone had ever written a rule for. The trust ladder caught it anyway, because the device fingerprints, spread across 11 supposedly unrelated transactions, shared a signature so subtle that no human reviewer would ever have noticed it. But the model saw it in under a second and flagged the entire ring before the 12th transaction cleared. Walter called me into his office that afternoon, back when his office was still just a slightly bigger desk in the same open room as everyone else's, and he didn't say much. He just looked at the report for a long moment, and then he looked at me, and he said, "You built something that thinks better than we do." And then he went back to work, because Walter, whatever else you want to say about him, never needed to make a moment bigger than it actually was. That's the thing Colton never once asked about. In 8 weeks of buzzwords and rebrand budgets and blockchain settlement rails nobody had requested, he never asked why the trust ladder re-verified continuously instead of once. He never asked what an 11-partner coordinated fraud ring looks like from the inside, or how close the company had come, in its earliest and most fragile years, to being quietly bled dry by exactly that kind of sophisticated, patient attacker before the system existed to catch it. He saw a black box that was, by every meaningful metric, outperforming every competitor in the market. And instead of asking what was inside it, he decided it needed a paint job. I think about that contract signing afternoon more than almost any other single day in this entire story, because it's the quietest one. And quiet moments are usually where the real decisions get made, long before anyone in a boardroom finds out about them. Elliot Whitfield had been Halcyon's outside counsel since before I joined, a courtly, sun-weathered man in his early 60s who billed by the hour and clearly resented every minute of it that wasn't spent within driving distance of a golf course. He wasn't incompetent exactly. I want to be fair to him, because I've met genuinely incompetent lawyers since, and Whitfield wasn't that. He was something more specific and, in its own way, more dangerous. Comfortable. He drafted the same category of employment agreement for small, ambitious tech companies for 2 decades, and by the time he sat down across from me with my red-lined draft, he had long since stopped reading every appendix on every contract with the kind of care he'd probably brought to the job in his 20s. He read the parts that mattered to him: compensation, equity, non-compete geography, the sections most likely to generate a phone call from an unhappy client, and he skimmed the rest, trusting, correctly in almost every other case he'd ever handled, that nobody was hiding anything dangerous in an appendix about intellectual property definitions. I met with him on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's carpet cleaner because Halcyon hadn't yet furnished its own. I remember he had his golf clubs visible through the window of his car in the parking lot. And I remember thinking, even then, that I should time this conversation to happen exactly when it did, an hour before he had somewhere else he wanted to be. "You've made some interesting changes here," he said, flipping through my red line with the specific speed of a man scanning for anything that would generate a follow-up meeting. "Compensation looks standard. Equity's fine, matches what Walter authorized. IP assignment." He paused for a fraction of a second on Appendix E, and I felt my pulse pick up, the way it does right before something either works perfectly or falls apart entirely. "Looks standard too. Company owns work product, developed during employment, using company resources. That's boilerplate." "There's an added subsection," I said, keeping my voice as flat and unremarkable as I could manage, just clarifying language around ownership continuity if the underlying security architecture changes materially. It's mostly there to protect the company, honestly. Make sure nobody can claim ambiguous ownership of the security layer if there's ever a change in leadership down the line. Keeps everything clean for due diligence. Every word of that was, I want to note, technically true. I simply left out which direction the ownership would flow once the ambiguity resolved. Whitfield nodded, already flipping to the next page. "Sensible. Company likes clean IP language, makes acquirers happy down the line." He didn't ask a single follow-up question. He didn't run it past Walter, who was, at that stage, still small enough of an operation to review most contracts personally, but who trusted Whitfield's judgment enough not to double-check something his lawyer had already blessed. Whitfield stamped the final page, slid the whole stack back across the table to me, and glanced at his watch. "That everything? I've got a 1 o'clock at the club." "That's everything," I said. He shook my hand, gathered his things, and was in his car within 4 minutes. And I sat alone in that conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner for a long moment afterward, looking down at a signed contract that I understood even then might sit dormant for years, might never matter at all, might simply be the kind of quiet, unused insurance policy you carry your entire career and never once have to file a claim against. I filed it away. I didn't think about it again for a very long time. Not really. Not until a 31-year-old man in a $5,000 suit sat uninvited on the edge of my desk and told me my life's work was giving him legacy energy. I want to say, in fairness to Whitfield, that I don't think what I did to him, using his golf course haste against him essentially, was entirely honorable. And I've made a kind of peace with that over the years. But I'll also say this. Nobody forced him to skim an appendix he was being paid quite well to read in full. I didn't lie to him. I described the clause accurately. I simply understood correctly that a man who wanted to be somewhere else would hear clarifying language and stop listening before he reached the part where the clarity ran entirely in my direction. That's not a trick. That's just paying closer attention than the person across the table, which, in my experience, is 9/10 of every negotiation that actually matters. There was one moment during those 9 long days between the security breach and the Ridgeline meeting that I haven't told you about yet, mostly because for about 6 hours it genuinely looked like it might unravel everything, and I still get a low hum of adrenaline in my chest thinking back on it. On the sixth day, Colton, apparently rattled enough by the lingering system instability that even he couldn't fully ignore it, brought in an outside technical auditor, a boutique cybersecurity consultancy out of Boulder that Halcyon occasionally used for compliance certifications, to do a rapid assessment of the fraud engine's current state ahead of the Ridgeline diligence process. I found out about it the way I found out about most things by then, secondhand, from Milo, who messaged me at 8:40 that morning. Heads up, there's an external auditor scheduled to review the fraud stack today. Thought you should know. My first reaction was something close to panic, if I'm being fully honest with you, because an outside technical audit was exactly the kind of thing that could accidentally surface the reversion clause days before I wanted it surfaced. If the auditor pulled the wrong document or asked the wrong question of the wrong person, Colton could conceivably learn what was coming and scramble to either patch the security breach quietly or, worse, try to preemptively terminate me before the deal collapsed on his terms instead of mine. I spent that entire morning in a state of controlled dread, watching the situation from a distance I had no authority to close, because showing up uninvited to insert myself into an audit I wasn't supposed to know about would have looked, at minimum, deeply strange, and possibly worse. What actually happened, as it turned out, was almost anticlimactic, in the specific way that near disasters often are once you're safely on the other side of them. The auditor, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Farah, whom Milo described afterward as clearly annoyed to be there, ran a standard technical assessment focused entirely on infrastructure and penetration testing, found the authentication handshake bypass immediately — it wasn't subtle — to anyone who knew what they were looking at, flagged it as a critical vulnerability in her preliminary report, and recommended immediate remediation. She did not, notably, review employment contracts, because that was never within her scope. And Colton, apparently more concerned with hiding the severity of the finding from his own board than with understanding its actual cause, instructed his team to characterize it internally as a known issue already being addressed, which, technically, was the single truest sentence anyone at Halcyon said that entire week, since I was, in fact, already addressing it, just not remotely in the direction he assumed. Milo forwarded me Farah's preliminary report that evening, through his personal email, the way I'd trained him to route anything sensitive. I read it twice, and I remember feeling, for the first time in 9 days, a genuine flicker of nerves. Not because the audit had found anything I didn't already know, but because it confirmed how easily the whole plan could have unraveled on a single bad coincidence, a single auditor who happened to ask the right person the wrong question at the wrong moment. Renata, when I called her that night, was characteristically unbothered. "It doesn't matter what an outside consultant thinks is happening," she told me. "It only matters what the contract says and what the logs prove. Their audit just independently corroborated your entire timeline from an unrelated third party with zero incentive to lie for you. If anything, Dana, that report just became one of the best pieces of evidence in your file." She was right, of course. Farah's report ended up, months later, as an exhibit in the formal licensing negotiation, an independent, dated, professionally produced confirmation that the breach had occurred exactly when I said it had, written by someone with absolutely no stake in the outcome either way. I want to leave you with one more scene before I wrap this up, because I think it's the moment that actually convinced me this story had a genuinely good ending, rather than just a satisfying middle. It happened about 3 weeks into Diane Okafor's tenure as interim CEO, during our first real negotiation session over the licensing terms, in a conference room that still had the same wilting flowers from the Ridgeline meeting, because apparently nobody at Halcyon had thought to replace them in the intervening chaos. Diane arrived to that meeting with her own copy of my full employment contract, printed, tabbed, and visibly annotated in the margins, in a handwriting so precise it looked almost typed. She'd read the whole thing. Not the summary memo some associate had prepared, not the highlighted excerpts Priya had flagged for the board. The entire document, appendices included, cover to cover, on her own time before she ever sat down across from me and Renata. "I want to start," she said, setting the marked-up contract on the table between us, "by telling you I've read every page of this twice, including Appendix E, which I gather is the section that ended two people's careers here in the last month." She looked at me directly, without the wounded defensiveness I'd braced myself for out of habit. "I don't think it's unconscionable. I think it's the single best drafted piece of employee IP protection I've read in 11 years of doing this job. And I say that as someone who now has to negotiate against it." "That's an unusual opening move," I said. "I found it's faster to just say the true thing first," she said, "and skip the part where we both pretend I'm here to relitigate whether you deserve what you're asking for. You do. The last two people who ran this company didn't understand the difference between owning a company and owning what makes the company work. I don't intend to repeat that particular mistake, mostly because I've already watched it happen twice from a distance, and it looked exhausting both times." We spent the rest of that meeting and several more over the following weeks, negotiating in the specific, almost pleasant way you negotiate with someone who has actually done the reading, disagreeing on numbers, on scope, on the exact boundaries of what counted as a material alteration requiring my sign-off going forward, but never once disagreeing on the basic premise that the contract meant what it said and that both of us were bound by it equally. It was, frankly, a novel experience after 2 months of dealing with people who treated a legally binding document as a suggestion they were free to reinterpret whenever it became inconvenient. Near the end of our final session, once the major terms were essentially locked, Diane set down her pen and looked at me for a moment longer than the business at hand strictly required. "Can I ask you something off the record?" "You can ask." "Did you know, back when you wrote that clause, that something like this would eventually happen? Some version of it?" I thought about that question longer than I expected to, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. "I didn't know it would be Colton specifically, or that it would happen this particular way," I said. "But I've been doing this long enough to know that eventually, in almost every company, somebody shows up who mistakes confidence for competence. And by the time everyone else in the building figures out the difference, real damage has usually already been done." I didn't write Appendix E because I expected Colton. I wrote it because I've met enough Coltons over the years to know the type always eventually shows up, even at companies that seem too careful for it, especially at companies that seem too careful for it, because that's usually exactly when everyone stops watching the door. Diane nodded slowly, and something in her expression settled. The specific look of a woman deciding in real time to run her own tenure differently than the two that had preceded her. "Well," she said, gathering her copy of the contract, tabs and all, "I intend to keep watching the door, for what it's worth." "For what it's worth," I said, "I believe you." And 6 months into her tenure at the time I'm telling you this story, I still do. The Sentinel Corps has run without a single unauthorized change to its security architecture since the day she took over, and Halcyon Pay, under her considerably less flashy, considerably more competent leadership, closed a modest Series C 11 months later with a different investor at a lower valuation than Colton had originally pitched to Ridgeline, but with clean books, an intact fraud engine, and a signed, fully executed licensing agreement that made absolutely clear, in language even a distracted golf course lawyer couldn't skim past, exactly who owned what. I'd be leaving something important out if I didn't address this directly, because it shaped nearly every interaction in this entire story, even the ones I haven't spelled out explicitly. Being a woman in this specific corner of the tech industry means you get underestimated with a consistency you could set a clock by. And I want to be honest that I used that deliberately more than once over those 9 days. Colton never once, in 8 full weeks of working 2 floors above me, asked me a technical question he actually wanted the real answer to. He asked me technical questions the way you'd ask a customer service representative to confirm something you've already decided, expecting agreement, mildly annoyed when he didn't get it, never once curious enough to actually sit with an answer that complicated his plans. Zane was worse, in a way, because he at least had the vocabulary of technical competence, enough jargon to sound plausible in a room full of people who also didn't fully understand what he was saying, which meant his confidence read as expertise to almost everyone except the people who actually knew better. Neither of them, not once, considered that the Boy Scout in the windowless supply closet, the one who wrote strongly worded memos and then, in their reading of things, always eventually folded, might simply be choosing her battles with more precision than they were capable of recognizing. Zane's exact words, if you'll recall, were that people like me always fold eventually. I've thought about that sentence more than almost any other single line from this entire story, because it's such a perfect, distilled example of the specific blind spot that took his company down. He mistook patience for weakness. He mistook the absence of a public confrontation for the absence of a plan. He assumed that because I wasn't shouting in meetings the way Colton did, I also wasn't doing anything at all, when in reality, I was doing the only thing that actually mattered, which was documenting, timestamping, and waiting for the exact moment my evidence would be undeniable to someone with the authority and the incentive to act on it. I don't say any of this to suggest that being underestimated is some secret advantage I'd recommend seeking out. It isn't. It's exhausting, and it costs you things along the way that don't show up cleanly in a story like this one. The years of being asked, gently, by well-meaning colleagues, whether I wanted to loop in a more senior engineer to sanity check my own architecture before a client demo. The specific tax of having to be twice as buttoned up, twice as documented, twice as prepared for every single conversation, just to receive the same baseline assumption of competence that men in that building were extended automatically on day 1 before they'd built anything at all. Colton walked in and was immediately treated, by nearly everyone except me and Owen, as though his last name was itself a credential. I walked in with 6 years of documented, measurable, industry-leading results, and still occasionally had junior analysts ask if I could loop in the actual architect on a call, assuming, reasonably enough given the pattern they'd absorbed from everywhere else in their careers, that the architect had to be someone who looked more like Colton than like me. What I will say, though, is that if you are underestimated long enough by enough people in a consistent enough pattern, you eventually learn to build your entire strategy around it. And there is a very specific, very quiet kind of power in being the person nobody in the room thinks to watch closely. Nobody double-checked my documentation habits because nobody thought to imagine I was building a case. Nobody worried about what I might do with silence because nobody credited me with a plan sophisticated enough to require silence as a tool. I let that underestimation do exactly what it always does to the people who rely on it. It made them careless, right up until the moment careless stopped being an option they had left. So that's the whole story. That's how a 5.5-year-old paragraph buried in an appendix nobody bothered to fully read, one small brush steel drive, and 9 days of very deliberate, very patient silence took apart a $250 million funding round and, eventually, the career of a man whose entire personality was built on the assumption that nothing would ever actually stop him. I didn't destroy Halcyon Pay. I want to end where I began, because I think it bears repeating now that you've heard the whole thing. I saved the only part of it that ever actually mattered. The part I built with my own 2 hands out of a legal pad and a space heater in a converted print shop. And I let the rest of it cut its own rot out, on its own timeline, once it finally had no other choice left. If you learned something today about reading the fine print in your own employment contract, and I mean that seriously, go actually read yours, tonight, all of it, especially the appendices nobody warns you about. Or if you just enjoyed watching a man who inherited everything hit a wall he never once saw coming at 100 miles an hour, go ahead and drop a comment. Let me know which part got you. I'll be right here, license fees rolling in at a very comfortable hourly rate. Writing code that belongs to exactly one person, building the next quiet, unglamorous, load-bearing thing that some future overconfident heir is going to try to touch without asking, someday, somewhere else, because they always do. Real power, I've come to understand, rarely announces itself with a shout. It doesn't need to. It sits quietly in Appendix E, Section 7.3, waiting, patient as a locked door, for exactly the one person reckless enough to try the handle without a key. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. See you in the next story.